Hi everyone, and welcome to this session with Jim Wallman on facilitating Megagames. Jim probably needs no introduction as being a very prolific designer in the Megagame community, and as his sign behind him says, no game survives contact with the players. So Jim, I'll shut up everything there and hand over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so welcome, yes, as I endlessly repeat, no game survives. Hopefully we will survive this session. What I'd like to do is to in a minute I'll share something and expose you to death by PowerPoint, but just to explain how I'm going to approach this, I'm going to talk at you for about 20 minutes, so make sure you've got your feet up and you've got your coffee ready and so on, and at the end of that, hopefully it will have thrown up questions, which and the core of this will be after I've chatted to you, is as you go along, if you think of questions, stick them in the chat, and Chris will be monitoring that and keep track of it, and also as part of what I'm going to say, I'm going to throw out some things which might raise questions for you, so but I'll explain that when I get to it. So as you go along, as you think of things you want to ask, bung them in the chat, and we'll try and pick up as much of that, or as much as that, the themes of that as we can. And the aim really is to expose some of my experience of thoughts on how to facilitate or how to be game control in a mega game, based on a little bit of experience. Much of this is the world according to Jim, so it'll contain some of my own very personal thoughts about what I think works and doesn't, and we will hopefully we'll throw out questions and thoughts and reflection on maybe your practice when you're control, or maybe your experience as a player interacting with control. So I'm now going to invoke the wonders of technology. Yes. Okay. What have I got to tell you? So I often with these things, you start with a definition, and they're always fraught with difficulty, because once you get into defining, as the world famous Defining Megagames group will tell you, you invite yourself into a world of pain. So in this instance, I'm suggesting that the controls role primarily is to make the whole experience feel as open-ended and real-world as possible, and allow you to have the opportunity to make mistakes as well as experience stunning successes. I'm going to delve into that approach to control, and the key for me here is this is about immersion. So let's say that you've not done control before. I'm imagining that some of you have done control before. Some of you might not have done. Some of you might not have only done a bit of it. But I have a few key points that I think are important about. So you want to be a control. What do I need to be? How do I need to be? Obviously, if you've already done facilitation in your real world day job, or your experience in education or whatever, you're pretty much there for a lot of the key skills. But I list here active listening, and I think this is quite important in a lot of games where control are operating a game system where the players tell them something they want to do and control adjudicate, making sure you've listened to what they're actually saying. It's important to have a degree of self-awareness, and that's quite a big subject, but kind of managing your own response to what's going on around you. Asking good open questions and guiding players without directing them is one of those things where it takes a fair bit of practice, and the difference between an open and a closed question is quite important. The ability to focus on the aims and purpose of the game. So in the case of most mega games, the aim is, and I think John Misen said it really important in our session, to make sure people have a good time. And so it's not about you as control, it's about the player's experience, and that they are not only engaged, but having fun. And therefore, and I have to say I'm pretty guilty of this myself, is focus on what the players need, rather than giving them a really fun anecdote or story about the early days of Megagaming, or about, some great thing that happened to you on the way to the game. It's not really about you. We all know that time management's important, and particularly in Megagames, where we hold the pace of the game as being very important. And finally, and not least importantly, social skills, especially around emotional literacy and empathy, and sense of humor. Now, sense of humor is very subjective. I am repeatedly accused of using dad jokes the whole time, but in my defense, I am a dad, so it goes with the territory. But some humor and understanding of what's going on around you and the responses of the people. This is a social activity. Control in a Megagame is about navigating a social environment, and so those skills are present to some degree in pretty much everybody. And certainly, if you've done facilitation, you are able to do that. So let's go through some of these. Providing advice and assistance to players is one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing. And particularly where there's a game structure, there are game mechanisms, processes, procedures that you want the players to go through, which can be more or less complex, with all sorts of nuances that you will have lovingly, as a game designer, you will have lovingly included, and which as a control, you will have deeply read and understood, but maybe the players don't. So you might include something on the nuances, but there's an important caveat to that, which I'll come on to. And advice includes options. So players will often, inexperienced players say, well, I just don't know what to do. I don't know what I can do. I don't know what to do in here. I'm completely stuck. And so the advice and assistance is in the form of, okay, you can do this or this or this. You've got these choices. There are these options. NPC advice is the one where you might say, well, that would be a courageous decision. It's where the players are proposing to do something which will really screw them up. And you can see that it's quite a difficult choice. You might, if it's appropriate, say, well, one of your non-played junior members of staff, or your cabinet advisor, or your deputy commander or something has said, you're really sure you want to do that, but you have to be cautious around that. And then you help players to explore the problem. So again, if you feel connected to the options and being stuck piece, the question like, have you thought about this aspect? Have you thought about that? Have you thought about the logistics, or have you thought about whether you've got enough money to do that thing? You don't have to be specific, but just open them up to thinking around problems if it looks like they've obviously missed something, or are not quite engaged. However, all of that said, advice doesn't include making player decisions for them. There is no alternative effect. You, as the control, with more information and understanding, might look at the situation and go, well, it's obvious what you should do now. You should attack through the Ardennes, or you should, go left flanking, or you should make a treaty with so and so. It's obvious. You absolutely don't say that to players. That's really unhelpful, because you're playing the game for them. And that really mitigates against our aim of enjoyment. You're not there to solve gameplay related problems, optimizing for players, telling them that they've made a non-cost-effective decision. That's their place, not yours. And the other one, which I come across and is a challenge, I think we've all faced it at various times, is when you're, for example, a team control with a team, you're supporting a team or group of players, you become a player, become part of the team. And that's quite destabilizing, because your role as control is as an authority. And so you will have disproportionate authority within a team of players because they see you as control, and that goes back to playing the game for them. So a team control can be an advocate for the team, but must be very cautious of not identifying with the team. Inclusion. This is really important. I probably could have put it further up in my slide pack. But facilitation and inclusion are deeply connected because MegaGames are pretty often a team sport. There are teams of players, and what we're often looking at in control and in facilitation is how those teams are best helped to work together. And you might get disparate groups of people, and a team might be a group of friends, but it might not be a group of friends. It might be a group of strangers. So even though you are not part of the team, we have a responsibility, in my view, that every voice is heard, and that you encourage the teams to do that and to accept diverse thinking. So this inclusion is not just about marginalizing particular groups, but inclusion of diverse thinking and diverse perspectives. And I recently involved in a study which is looking at how diversity affects decision-making in war games. One of the key findings, among many, was that diversity reduces risk. So that's an interesting selling point to teams, that that where teams are diverse and listen to diverse thinking, the risk of them missing something important is massively reduced. And this is backed up by research. Diversity of itself doesn't necessarily make decisions better, but it definitely has an impact on the risk of missing something important. So, you can always feed that back. And my other one, which I think is really important, and it's related to inclusion, is that good manners matter. So you might be role-playing a complete bastard in a game. You might be role-playing an evil genius. You might be role-playing all sorts of things, but that doesn't give you permission to be a jerk. I was going to use a different word, but I'm too polite. Just because it's role play, it's a little bit like the thing in general life where somebody says, "Oh, can't you take a joke? I was only messing about." Not acceptable, really not acceptable in an inclusion sense. I think we have a reasonable expectation for basic politeness and good social manners to apply in these social events. The footnote is that we have faced perhaps a greater problem when we've been playing online, where a lot of the social cues can be missed. So we all take responsibility to be good-mannered, to be clear about when they're role-playing, and not to use role-playing as an excuse to be a jerk. So what about that? So we're looking out for unacceptable behaviours, and I'm sorry about the lists, and I suspect everybody knows this already, but it does no harm to remind you. Talking over people, again, we've all done it. I think, well, there probably are people that don't do it, but I don't think the Dalai Lama does it, but most people will do it at some point. But it's about being aware of when someone else is talking. One of the pluses of some of the online stuff is that a lot of online systems, if you talk over someone, then everybody can't hear what's going on. Very often it overloads the system. And I've noticed there's been quite a much better practice in recent years of people actually taking turns to talk. Not in every case, but sometimes. So be aware that you might be really burning to say something, but just take a pause, take a step back. Am I talking over? Have I started talking before they've stopped? And I'll be letting our enthusiasm carry us away. And that's where control and facilitation steps in, and you can pause somebody, say, hang on a minute, they haven't finished. We'll hear what you have to say. But we also have responsibility as players to remember this. Personal comments, especially belittling or patronizing ones, but also inappropriate personal comments. And that can be about someone's appearance. You might be intending to be complimentary, but the intent is not the same as how a message is received. And so be very cautious around any personal comments. The ones that I've encountered might be things like, I don't know, someone who's the youngest member of the group being referred to as a boy or a kid, that kind of thing. So not intended as in any way critical, or not intended in anything other than maybe friendly banter, but it can detract from people's enjoyment. Dismissal. Well, yes, I'm just not going to listen to you. I'm not interested in your ideas. I'm not interested in what you have to say. Twaddling, going on and on and on about something and taking it a bit like filibustering, but just going on and on about twaddle. Okay, fair enough. You could argue that's what I'm doing now, but twaddling, you kind of watch out for in the facilitation role of you do have a responsibility to shut people up politely, but clearly. And also be aware of when we do this ourselves. Needless authority. Quote from the famous "You Have No Authority Here," Jackie Weaver. And this is where somebody takes charge when they're not really supposed to take charge, and where they claim authority, which is maybe not built into the game, not part of the game process, and you need to watch out for people. And it will often be people who are very confident, very experienced, very knowledgeable, but they will. It's a question of when they're over dominating a group, a particular team. I'm not going to explain mansplaining for obvious reasons. If you really have never heard that term before, and it's possible, Google will give you plenty of background, but mansplaining is a problem. It's a thing. And again, politeness requires you to not to assume that the other person doesn't know what you're talking about, or needs it all explained to them. You might say to somebody, well, of course, you might say, well, are you aware of the Locarno Treaty? And they might say, actually, yes, it was a subject of my doctoral thesis. Or they might say, no, I've never heard Locarno's treaty, in which case you can then give them your very, very erudite description of the Locarno Treaty and all is well. But if it was their doctoral thesis, there's nothing more annoying than someone explaining something to you that you're expert in. I've just explained mansplaining. There we go. That said, for Megagames and for any game, there's standard setting that's required, and that's useful to make that explicit wherever you can. So if you're facilitating as the host of a megagame, the runner of a megagame, reading the room. So, and again, those of us done this a bit, will be looking around for uninvolved players, people who are looking out the window, who are in a team and clearly not saying anything, not doing anything. Distracted players, someone's on their phone the whole day and don't really look at anything. Player conflicts, and those can happen. And also for people who have been triggered or who are in distress, and that might be also. There are all sorts of anxieties. Some of them are not visible, some of them are. Some of them may be the root of the things above, but you do need to be aware that these are real things, and to some degree, as the host, we have a responsibility for at least acknowledging something's going on, and ideally attempting to support our players as we go forward. And all these things you have to do as control that are really advisable in facilitating a game require you to pay attention to self-care. So, and I know this sounds a bit kind of being a parent here and saying, oh, make sure you've got enough sleep, And when I was a younger megagame designer and control, not sleeping the night before was possible. Sadly, I actually did that, but it's not helpful. And now in later life, not getting enough sleep is a disaster. But you do need to be facilitating a megagame. Those of you that are doing it regularly know you have to be on your game. So So going down the pub and getting rat ass the night before is fun, but trust me, if you haven't tried it, don't. Running a mega game or controlling a mega game with a hangover is a bad idea. Eat healthy food. I know, that's preachy, a bit preachy, but it really does make a difference. Make sure you've got hot drinks. They're better than cold drinks. And I think there's some good evidence that energy drinks are a false economy. It's primarily the sugar. And when we're doing a day-long mega game, they'll get you going past the hangover, lack of sleep, etc. to start with, but you really will flag as the day goes on. And avoid alcohol for much the same reasons. And again, we've had experience of mega games and alcohol. And whilst there are moments when it's absolutely hilarious, there are other moments where it's really not. And for control, you really are off your game if you're having even a nice sociable drink during the game. So I don't want to be too preachy about it, but this is based on experience. The other thing that's important is to take time out if you need it. So even if it's 5 minutes, there's a lot going on, it can be really intense. You're bombarded by questions, by things you've got to do. I've just outlined a whole raft of things as facilitation you've got to get involved in. It can be a bit much. It can be very much. It's okay to say to whoever's running the game or to someone else, if you are the person running the game, look, I'm going to take 5 minutes. You can usually find a time, even in the most intense game, and step outside of the building, walk around the building, walk across the road and find a cafe and buy a cup of tea. Just needs to, short period of time, breathing air outside of the game environment, which can be very, very intense, especially for control. And then also speak to other members of the control team. If it's challenging for you, you don't get a medal for bravery, for charging into a difficult situation you find difficult, that's already difficult, and trying to sort it out. If you've got difficulties, or you feel challenged, or you feel this is really hard, going to be a hard thing for me to address this issue, speak to the rest of the team and get their support and say, look, this player or this situation I'm really concerned about, and I need support with this. Can you help? Can you come with me? So if it's personally challenging for you, don't put yourself, if you like, emotionally at risk. Really important. So a little bit on troubleshooting. You were also doing a lot of stuff, facilitating a game on troubleshooting. Classic ones are, I generally assume players read their briefing on the bus or the train going to the game. Hopefully they don't read it on the motorway as they're driving to the game. But they may be that they haven't had time to read it, haven't had the inclination to read it. And I have often come across cases where the players have not read it at all and turn to control and say, how do I play this game? What are the rules? What am I supposed to do? And that's one of those challenges where you have to manage your time. So it's not necessarily control's job to read out the briefing for the players. And one of the only things you can do is if somebody actually hasn't read it, actually doesn't get it, you can either involve the rest of their team and get them to support their player. And if that's not appropriate, it's also okay to give a player a timeout and say, look, you've obviously, for whatever reason, you've obviously not had time to read this. We'll find space for you in the day to sit down in a corner and just have a quick read through. If you've got time as control to completely bring someone up to speed, or the game is sufficiently simple or intuitive that that's not a problem, then of course that's fine. But it's quite risky to get drawn into filling in player not understanding or knowing. And we talked a little bit about players feeling out of their depth and how you support them and how you give them guidance. But there is also the time when when the game role's not holding their attention. It's just not working for them. And those are quite tricky ones to deal with. And they can be a design problem. They can be a player personality problem. They could be team problems and so on. And you will have to find ways of dealing with those as they come up. It's worthwhile thinking about it in advance. It's worthwhile thinking about stuff like that in the design stage, but also as a control team, it's worthwhile knowing that these are things that might come up. A player is having a bad day, year, life, whatever. I've had that where a player walked out of the game halfway through. So I concerned, followed, and talked to him, and he was having a really bad day. He was having a really bad time in his personal life, and he just couldn't cope. Nothing to do with the game, but at least he knew that we'd paid it. We'd been supportive. He ended up going home. He was, not in a good way, but that can happen, and it's worth. And sometimes it can be a real problem if they're having a bad time in their personal life and they try to carry on, and it leaks into the game. So you kind of have to watch out for those. Watch out for players who do decision shopping. I think we've talked about this in a number of forums, but the player who goes around asking each member of control for a ruling on a particular rule they don't like, in the hope that one of the controls will give them an answer they like. And again, the control team needs to shut that down if at all possible. Interpersonal problems crop up, not just player-to-player personal conflicts, but also player control conflicts. And this is a kind of group thing. Giving players timeouts is maybe not in the sporting sense, but it's entirely acceptable to have a private conversation with a player and say, look, can you just step away from this for a bit. Player to control conflicts, this is where I come back to, you're a control team, get support. It's not unknown for specific players to wind up specific controls where there's just personalities just don't gel. And so it's up to the rest of the team really to support that, not to support their control necessarily, but to create a space, create an opportunity for that not to develop into something too personally upsetting. We also often have to deliver unpopular game results to players, and everyone likes to shoot the messenger. And so one of the control facilitation tasks is to hold on to a sensitive way of delivering bad news. So you might turn up to a team and say, yes, well, your last move, your entire army's been destroyed, everyone's running away, and you failed utterly. So that's true. That might be what's actually happened, but that's not going to be received well. On the other hand, you might say, look, it's not gone well. The good news is you're all personally still alive and you're surrounded by a few loyalists and your army's not really in a very good state. So you can soften the blow, but bear in mind that the players are there to enjoy themselves. They're not really there to experience deep feelings of pain, crisis, and failure, although there is value in that. The other one are the pedantic rule mongers and optimizers. Lovely people, they're very good, however, Megagames are not usually really tightly crafted game systems. They have a degree of flexibility, of fudge, of judgment call by control. I thought it's a lovely example earlier of the Melbourne group taking on board a half-baked sort of game, which had a great idea, but much of the game was constructed on the fly, and that sort of game would be really not terribly successful. It's not very easy to optimize in that situation, which is part of the attraction of those games. But we do have to manage that, and in some cases to point out how inappropriate that is. Right, I've whittled on, I've twaddled on for quite a long time, a little bit longer than I'd hoped. But that's a kind of core of the world according to Jib that I wanted to do. Before we go on to dealing with questions, I'm going to throw out some questions for you, and I'll maybe leave these up for you to look at. And in fact, I've used something like this as part of a kind of practice session, but I'd be interested for you to look at them. I'm just going to run through them. I've got a set of what would you do questions, and this I'd like those here to listen to that, look at that, and think about whether you've experienced that in the past, and if you haven't, what might you do? Or if you have experienced it, what did you do? And it's just some examples of things from, if you like, from real life. So I'm just going to post this up on here. So there are I identified 5 examples of things that can happen. And so one of them is a player at the back of the room reading a newspaper, someone disengaged. Issue 2 is someone opinion shopping. Issue 3 is 2 players having a Barney, and clearly, there's something emotional going on. Issue 4 is a player who's turned up and might even be in the wrong room, but doesn't know anything, never done a mega game before, doesn't know what to do, not even sure why they came. And issue 5 is, and you've obviously got a super experienced mega game designer who's turned up and decides to question your design as when the game starts, and asking you to explain why you've done it, and that it can't make any sense of your game because I wouldn't have designed it like that. So if I can hand back to Chris, I haven't seen any questions, if there are any, but I'd also like to see what people have come up with, if anything.
Yeah, no, there's been no questions at the moment. So if anybody does obviously respond to the issues that Jim's put on the screen there, but if you have any questions, then please do feel free to put them in the chat window or into the Q&A. Yeah, you'll obviously see the responses there. Yeah, from Ed there. Issue 5, grounds for immediate ejection.
That's an interesting one. I'll start off by just responding to Ed on that. And I think. Yes, kick them out. I love that. So this happened to me, interestingly, not in a mega game. Well, it was a mega game, but it was in a mega game in a professional context. And I found it really challenging. And I think in the end they left. And it was a fascinating example of somebody who didn't understand what I was trying to do in the game. But I found my challenge was to kind of try not to be defensive, and try because I was trying to run the game at the same time, to try not to get too distracted by this issue. And so it took and it kicked off with one of the controls who didn't handle it very well. Another control then got involved and realized that they needed to involve me as a game designer. And so there was, at one point, there's like 3 of us trying to manage this person who I discovered later was also had just flown over from the States and was suffering from jet lag and was tired and grumpy for all sorts of other reasons. But at the time, it's like, oh shit, what am I going to do here? So yeah, I think that's really interesting about about somebody who's, and this was somebody who genuinely was very experienced and knowledgeable. So again, I couldn't just say, well, what do you know? Not that I would, but
but also, like you just mentioned, taking three people's time up from running the game. That's obviously
it became very quickly became an issue. And so that's a real challenge. Okay, what else have we got?
Mostly folks talking about issue 5 and sort of asking them to write so Nick said ask them to write down their feedback and say that you'll work through it later. Obviously right now we're going to run the game, and there's a bunch of other people here that are here for the game.
Exactly.
Johan's just said for issue 2 and 5, this also happened to him, and he tried to explain to the player that the game is designed to be enjoyed by all players. He'd come up with this plan. He'd come up with this plan to game the system, but the system wouldn't allow for it. Basically tried to bypass the council game, and no control would actually allow him to do that. And so after 15 minutes, he decided to leave. So yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? But like sometimes in that position, somebody's got to leave, haven't they? It's not going to work for them.
Yeah, and that's exactly what has happened with me. And again, I recognise Johan's experience completely. And you hope that they realise that whatever it was they came to the game to do isn't going to work, and they leave, and that's possibly self-correcting, hopefully, in time. But it's not before it's done its job of disrupting you and giving you a headache.
Yeah. You probably experienced issue 3, Jim. How do you deal with that? with two players sort
I
of
separated.
raised conversation in the corner?
I've had two players about to start a fight, and I separated them.
Wow.
And kept them apart for the rest of it. Fortunately, we were in a multi-room environment, so I was able to keep them physically apart, and I briefed the control team to keep them apart. And they kind of knew that wasn't going to work for them to encounter. But it was, unfortunately, it's not a good look when Eisenhower and Roosevelt are about to come to blows. But
no, not so much. For issue 1, Nick said, when there's an appropriate pause in the game, go and ask them why they're reading the newspaper.
And that's what I did. And they had a hangover, and that was the answer to that. They were really struggling and decided they needed some time out. But not that they didn't want to play the game or they were unhappy with their role or any of that. They just needed a break. But you only know that by asking them.
Yes, absolutely, engaging them totally. For issue 1 again, Johan said he dedicated control to go and engage the player in some other part of the game if they're not into the map game. But obviously, like you said, obviously that person in particular had a hangover. So. Bernie said for issue 1, this has been me in a game. I've issued the orders and now try to do some try to do so, impress upon the enemy by doing other things, and that really confused the enemy. I can imagine it did. So for issue 4 then, when the player comes to you and says, I don't understand what I'm supposed to be doing, I don't know anything about Megagames, how have you dealt with that? Obviously that's sort of a bit of a confusing state for them.
And so that's one where that takes a slightly longer conversation. If we can, and we've Mega Makers for a while had a practice of having a kind of a new player control, and I think some groups have done this, whose job it is to actually sit with that person or spend time with that person, and they don't have, if you put aside a control to manage that situation. We particularly had it when there was a lot of newcomers coming into games who literally had not had they were deer in the headlights. They'd never really seen anything like this before or know what to do, and it turned up because their mate said, let's go and try this cool thing. And so you can either find a friendly, experienced player who will sit with them, and they need, I say everyone's different, but often it needs time. It needs just a conversation about how to gently get into this, suggesting that, don't worry, stay with the team, offer some suggestions. You don't have to engage with engage with it in a small way, and so on. Obviously, every case is different, but the key point here is whether you've organized your game so that you have got a bit of slack in your control team. If your control team are blue-ass flies charging around all over the place, it's a real problem because you've effectively lost the potential mega gamer if that's not addressed.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, don't do that. For issue 4 as well, Nick mentioned or asked, what would you say that learn by doing, and then just encourage them to figure out what works by playing the game?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And then Patrick mentioned for 4, in the past he's tried to break down the game and just ask them open-ended questions like, what does your briefing say, or how can you go about doing that?
Yeah. That's absolutely true. I mean, there's degrees attached to that. So on the one hand, you've got someone who is literally never been to a mega game and has no concept of what it is they could even, not watched, shut up and sit down, not seen anything, just turned up because their friends brought them. That's one level. The other level is people who've got a little bit of an idea, but as Patrick says, you direct them to something where they can kind of try and follow it up themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And then probably finally at this point, for issue 2, Ed has said he'd want to shut that issue down hard. Opinion shopping eats into control bandwidth and gives players an unfair advantage when it isn't caught. If they genuinely think the control has gone against the written rules, and obviously that can happen, then there's one thing, but if Control is just making the call, the player just has to go with it at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of practice I would encourage, is that you shut it down and you have a conversation with the player which says, don't do this. we've noticed you're asking different controls the same question, stop. And it has to be as simple as that. Just say, stop doing that.
Yes, absolutely. And we've got some other questions coming through, so I don't know if you want to answer those now, or if you've got any more content.
Sure,
you want to go through.
yeah, okay. We've got time.
Excellent. Yeah, so Benedict asked, what would you do if you notice that the game is going very badly for one team and they start losing, they're not having fun because of it?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, and that segues. That's partly a design issue and partly a control issue. So on the one hand, if there's a possibility for a team to be killed off effectively or to lose badly, if that's actually within the bounds of possibility within the game system, you have to have a plan B for teams that are either knocked out or seriously discommoded. So what I had with various iterations of Watch the Skies, when in the early versions we had some spare teams, so if a team got completely knocked out or deposed or whatever. However, it's possible. I draw your attention to my saying, no game survives first contact with the players. No matter how well designed it is, players can do very badly because that's always an opportunity for them to get it, to either be very unlucky or just get it badly wrong. In that instance, I think there are a number of issues around how you re-engage them. So it might be that's an opportunity for some very rapid made upology to get them back into the game, maybe giving them some assets that gives them some choices. Personally, I'm very interested in the dynamics of defeat, and actually there are some really interesting questions about what do you do, what do you do if you're defeated? So your army's been scattered to the four winds, and everyone's running away. There's actually a game in how do you manage running away. So there's, and it's a bit, you can maybe dive a little bit into role playing, try and bring them into a role play, ask them some generating questions, but a lot of that is kind of making it up as you go along, and that's good if you've got an experienced team who can do that successfully. Maybe got some people who are experienced DMs or whatever, but it's better if you've got a pre-plan. If you've got something that you can say, okay, we accept you. You've all been completely buggered. You that's it. You're out. We're now going to make you this team and give them a new briefing, a new set of resources, and there you go. So it's one of those. It depends, but it's really quite important, as I think Benedict identified, that a team that's really got maybe halfway through the game, it's all gone horribly wrong for them. You really don't want to go away feeling completely crushed and defeated.
Yeah, that's the worst thing. That's right, absolutely. And we've got a couple of minutes left and a couple more questions, so I might just quickly ask them. One from Nick: what's the best way for a member of the control team to obtain feedback from other members of the control and the players on their skills and how they should improve?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I'm reminded of I'm going to twaddle now. I'm reminded of a scene from Churchill and the Generals where Montgomery is talking to Churchill, and he says, Prime Minister, some of your generals are really very bad, very poor. And Churchill says, well, do they know that? And Montgomery says, oh yes, I tell them. And so I think that there's an element of, are you really going to say to your fellow controls, that was a bit rough? That said, I think there's a real value in post-game wash-up for controls to talk about how it went for them, what you've learned from that. And I think it's important, I increasingly think it's important that we as controls and as facilitators reflect on our skills and our experience and think about how we can work better. One of the areas which I didn't talk about, but which I think is interesting, is the whole piece of how the control team works as a team. So there's a lot here about how as an individual control facilitator you work, but there is a team element as well. And that requires, that kind of 360-degree consideration of both how you performed as a control, but also some reflection on your team members. That said, you're doing this as a hobby. People are rocking up, volunteering their time and doing their best. So we do the best we can. It's not a professional gig. This is for fun, and it's great if people are interested in improving.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're on the time, but it was such a good conversation. I might just do one final question from Jacob. How well does GMing a tabletop role-playing game translate into control roles for a mega game? And how much mega game experience should you get before you think about doing a control role?
Right. So the DMing is a really, really valuable core skill. If you've run any kind of role-playing game, you're pretty, in a lot of cases, you're pretty much there. The difference between obviously doing that and doing a mega game is you're working as part of a team. So whereas as a GM, it's your world, it's your universe, my gaff, my rules kind of thing. And but the core skills about engaging with the players, supporting narrative, all of that sort of social skill stuff, that if you're doing that, and particularly it's more noted in people who do homebrew stuff and do, I mean, it's all good, but homebrew stuff is really good because they're kind of often thinking around the process a bit more, or freeform role-playing games. But any kind of running a role-playing game is important, not important, really useful. And in fact, this is advice I give, and others have given in the professional wargaming, professional serious gaming world, is DMing or GMing, running role-playing games is a really good training and it's fun. So I would say, yeah, really important and good. And the question on how many mega games should you take part in? Ideally, you need to have experienced a mega game before you try to control one. That said, of course, I had never experienced a mega. No, I had experienced a mega game when I started Control, but I think my first involvement in a mega game was as Control. So it's not a rule; it's more like guidelines, really.
Yeah. Fair enough. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. So yeah, that kind of draws your presentation to a close. Then, thank you so much, Jim. It's been really really interesting to hear what you had to say. The next presentation will start at 1:15 UK time, so there's a little bit of time. So if anybody wants to gather in the pub on the Discord server, on the MegaCon Discord server, you're more than welcome. We can continue to chat. But yes, thank you very much, Jim. It's been absolutely excellent. So appreciate it.
Pleasure.